For Halloween, my boyfriend Steven took me to a fortune teller for the first time. I'd always been curious about these sort of things, but I didn't want to waste money on it. The only reason I agreed to go with him was because he'd gotten a coupon in the mail. We went to a tiny building that I never noticed before. Its sign said Madame Zara, Psychic Readings and Mystical Memorabilia, with a little lightning bolt logo. When we entered, an old woman with too much makeup on greeted us. She looked like someone who would call herself Madame Zara. Her real name was probably Jennifer or something. She guided us towards a circular table where she kept her crystal ball. She handed her the coupon, and then she started the reading. She gave us some generic predictions, nothing too interesting, and then she froze. Her eyes widened as if she was seeing some horrible vision. It was obviously a performance, but she was pretty believable. "What did you see?" Stephen asked with genuine nervousness. "I see a sword with a red handle," she said. "One of you will murder the other with that sword." What a load of crap. I looked at Stephen, and his eyes were wide with fear. Then he forced himself to laugh and said, "Yeah, I doubt that." He acted like he didn't believe it, but I knew my boyfriend well enough to know that the prediction unnerved him. Madame Zara continued with our reading, but she kept stopping herself to warn us about that sword. Its image kept interrupting all her other visions. Well, that's what she said anyway. When she was done, Stephen gave her a big tip and we left. On the drive back home, we all joked about this experience. He said that he didn't believe a word, but I knew that wasn't true. Back home, we sat on our porch and handed out candy to trick-or-treaters. We'd done the same thing last year, and it was a total blast. This time, Stephen seemed really distracted. It wasn't fun anymore. I eventually gave up and went back inside without him. To keep myself busy, I took out the trash. While I was tying up the bag, I noticed some cardboard in the rest of the trash. It was a torn-up remnant of a delivery box, a long, sword-shaped delivery box. Stephen's nervous reaction to the fortune teller suddenly would make sense. He had a sword delivered here. Might even have a red handle as well. Why did he buy a weapon without telling me? What if Madame Zara was right about the sword? Then that mean that maybe she was right about Stephen killing me with it. I knew I might have been overreacting, but I couldn't risk it. I grabbed the box as evidence and hurried towards the side door. I planned to sneak around the side of the house and get to my car before Stephen could see me. I tried to be as quiet as I could. I got to the side yard, and I could see my car directly in front of me. But before I could reach it, Stephen called my name. I stupidly turned around. He stood on the porch, holding a red-handled sword against his chest. "I can explain." I didn't give him the chance. I jumped in my car and sped off. He chased after my car for a while, but once I turned onto the main road outside the neighborhood, I lost him. I couldn't go to the police. They would just think I was crazy. No crime had been committed yet, and any cop in our small town would just doubt it. I could have gone straight to my sister's, but I didn't want my sister in any kind of danger either. The only option I had was to go back to the fortune teller. I parked in front of her shop, the sign shining above me. I looked at the lightning bolt logo, and I recognized it from somewhere else. I looked back down at the torn-up cardboard box. The return address had the same lightning bolt logo. That could mean only one thing. Madame Zara was scamming us. From what I could tell, her company had sold Stephen that sword, then sent him the coupon for a psychic reading, where she pretended to see the sword in her vision. The only thing I didn't understand was her end goal. Why would she start to manipulate me into suspecting my boyfriend of murder? I had to find out. I pushed my way inside. Madame Zara was sitting at her table, scrolling through her phone. She jumped at my sudden arrival. I was about to tell her what I discovered, but I figured it would be better to trick the truth out of her. So I made myself look extra panicked and I screamed, "You were right. My boyfriend was going to kill me with that sword, so I murdered him first. And now I don't know what to do." That was obviously a lie, but it had the desired effect. Madame Zara was panicked. "You killed him?" "Yes," I lied. "Like you predicted. Please help me. I don't want to go to jail." "You need to call the police." she told me. I can't. I killed him. With that, Madame Zara finally confessed. All she wanted was to get customers. She'd used her mystical memorabilia business to get information, and when we came in, she made up her visions to manipulate and distrust each other. The goal was to trick us into believing that we'd come back for more readings, but she never wanted things to escalate the way that they did. Except they didn't escalate. I really didn't kill my boyfriend. Now I knew the truth, and I told her that I was going straight to the police to turn myself in, and I'd tell them how she manipulated me into killing him. That made her really nervous. She begged me to reconsider. I told her I would keep her secret if, maybe, this fake psychic would give me $1,000 to keep quiet. She even had an NDA ready to sign, which I happily did. Cash in hand, I went back home. Stephen explained that he bought the sword because he thought it was cool. He was a little embarrassed by it, though, especially since it was so expensive. He explained that he was going to tell me about it eventually, but our psychic reading was just an escalation of things. We never had another psychic reading again. The red-handed sword is proudly displayed on our wall, and honestly, Stephen was right. It is pretty cool.
After the divorce from my wife, Lacey, I had to move into a really crappy apartment. Lacey got to keep the house. I could have fought her more in the divorce, but I always had this thought in the back of my head that one day Lacey and I would get back together. I had just moved into my new place when I got an alert on my phone. It was from the Ring camera app in my old house. It was just footage of Lacey standing on the front porch with her arms full of groceries. I felt like a creep for spying on her. That was her house now, and I shouldn't have access to the Ring camera, especially since she obviously forgot that it was even there. I thought about calling the company and canceling the whole thing, but then I stopped myself. It was an expensive house in a very isolated area. The Ring camera was a necessary security feature. In the end, I decided to keep it installed and watch out for anything suspicious. I also didn't tell Lacey. Looking back, that was a pretty big mistake. One night, I got a notification from the Ring camera. It was 3 a.m, and Lacey was never out that late. I turned on the live feed and saw a man with tattoos all over his face. He barely looked human with all those tattoos. I watched the video as the man looked straight into the camera and smiled, as if he knew someone was watching. He didn't move for a long time, just staring and smiling. And then finally, he gave a little half wave to the camera and walked back into the night. I had to tell Lacey, even if that would mean exposing myself. I called her at about 3:30 in the morning. It took her a while to answer, and when she did, she still sounded half asleep. "I don't want to scare you," I said, "but I just got an alert on the Ring camera. There was a guy with all these face tattoos just outside your front door." I guess my words finally woke her up. "What?" she screamed. "You've been spying on me?" And she hung up the phone. She didn't believe me. I called her the next day, but she didn't answer. Then I called the day after that. Still no answer. Worried, I went back to the house, but it was completely empty. Lacey's car was still in the driveway, but there was no sign that she was there. Even her bed was made. Without any other options, I drove to the police station to report a missing person. The officer wrote down everything I said. I made sure not to leave anything out. Then he called in the police chief and he gave a quick summary of what I just said. The chief looked strangely familiar, but I wasn't sure where I'd seen him from. Then it hit me. He looked exactly like the man outside Lacey's house. He didn't have any of the same tattoos, but his face was the same. He glared at me, and I could tell from his expression that he knew I recognized him. He screamed, "I don't believe this man for a second! Lock him up until he tells us the truth!" The other officer was much younger than his boss, so he kept his head lowered and muttered, "Yes, sir." The police chief hurried off while his officer took me to a holding cell and locked me up. "Sorry," he said, and I could tell he was being genuine. He believed my story even though his boss didn't. I stayed in that cell for hours, losing all hope of saving Lacey. Then, after what felt like forever, the police officer came back and unlocked my cell. "I'm free to go?" I asked. "Not technically," he explained. "I'm going against orders here, but as soon as you mentioned about tattoos, I had my suspicions about the captain. I've seen him when he's off duty, covered in those things as some kind of disguise. And Captain Arnold never treats witnesses the way he's treating you." I was happy to have him on my side, but I didn't know what we were going to do next. Then the officer said, "I know Captain Arnold has a private shed in his yard that no one is allowed to see. If we're going to find your ex-wife, I think that's where we should start." So the officer, whose name was Capaldi, took me out of the station and drove me to Captain Arnold's house. We snuck around the side, careful not to make too much noise, and we reached his shed. We could tell through the cracks that lights were on inside. Officer Capaldi was about to knock, but instead, he threw open the door and ran inside, gun ready. I was right behind him. I couldn't believe what I saw. The shed had been redesigned into a makeshift tattoo parlor. Lacey was tied to a metal slab while the police chief drew horrific tattoos on her entire body, including her face. To make the scene even more disgusting, the captain was wearing those same fake tattoos on his face, making him look more like a witch doctor than a policeman. Lacey screamed through the rag in her mouth. Officer Capaldi stepped closer. "Drop the needle," he ordered. But the captain wasn't using a tattoo needle. He was using what looked like a Sharpie marker. That gave me a little bit of relief. Whatever weird tattoo thing this man had, at least it wasn't permanent. Just very, very weird. Slowly, the captain dropped the marker and raised his hands. He stepped toward us, acting like he was giving up. That was only an act. When he got close enough to Officer Capaldi, he wrestled the gun out of his hand and shoved him to the ground. Then he ran away. I ran over to Lacey and untied her from the slab. "It hurts! It hurts!" she kept repeating, as if the Sharpie marker was eating into her, like acid. Rather than go back to the police station, Officer Capaldi took us straight to the hospital. The doctors treated Lacey as best they could, but in the end, they couldn't wash off any of the markings. Whatever special marker he was using, it wasn't just ink. It was permanent. It's been a while since this all went down. Lacey's out of the hospital. She wants to get back together, but now, I'm not so sure. On the one hand, I'll always love my wife, but on the other, I can't stand to look at her anymore.
I'm a simple man. I've always desired to live a simple life as a free man and as a prisoner behind these bars. I have received as a reward for my simple life quite an unremarkable existence. It's all that anybody in my position would ask for. I was born 20 years ago in a small town with roads that had no streets and houses that had no numbers. My family was poor, but we had enough for sustenance. We were all we had at the time. My mother, my father, my brother Daniel, and I, David. My father worked in construction, and my mother tended to the homestead because I could not be left alone as a child. You must understand that my living conditions are quite unique. Some would say special. But I didn't let my Down syndrome affect my perspective in the matters that I can control. I was playful as a child, and I enjoyed the humor of my family every chance I got to spend with them. I had a good childhood with the love of family until my father died when I was smaller. It fell to my mother to take care of Daniel and I, while providing the same care as she would have, and I feared that her poor heart could not maintain the pressure. So she died a few years later, leaving Daniel and I to ourselves. Daniel cared for me, and I almost never lacked for anything. He was a good brother, the best brother I could have asked for. He never left my side, and he always made sure that I was in good spirits for all those years. Daniel was the bright one. I remember when I was smaller, he had a chance to go to college in some city far away, and when he asked if he could bring me along, and he was told no, he declined it. He said he would rather stay in town and take care of me than leave me for education in someplace else. I cried myself to sleep that night because I knew Daniel would never leave me, and I was grateful for it. Years passed and I was 21, just as Daniel was 24, and I noticed a beautiful damsel would come around the house for Daniel's company. I liked her presence at first until I noticed she took more and more of Daniel's time the more frequently she came. I didn't like it, and I told Daniel that it hurt me when he spent more time with his new friend than he did with me. He said he liked her, just as much as he liked me, and he would love to marry her. I could not fully reconcile what he meant, but at that point, I started to loathe her. Daniel married Becca after a year of their friendship, and they left for the city without me. It was the first time I was living without my brother in my life, and it was one of the hardest periods I've had to live through. I hated Becca even more as the years passed and Daniel's calls became less frequent. The fact that she had taken my brother from me, with her to the city, was enough to loathe her eternally. It all culminated to one event on a sunny afternoon when the home phone rang and it was Becca on the phone sobbing. I asked her what had happened and she broke down, telling me that Daniel had been in a car crash. I was devastated. Daniel would not have been in a car crash if she had not taken him to the city. I cried and cussed her. I was brimming with so much rage at Becca that I knew I could not control what I felt except I acted on it. So I invited Becca to our home to talk about it. She gave me a date that she would be visiting and I made plans. When the day finally came, I was ready. Becca arrived about 10 minutes early, but it didn't matter much because I had spent days meticulously planning what I would do to her. I saw her stand behind the couch in the living room and I, livid, suffocating on the terrifying thoughts that were in my head. The sheer gore of my imagination had made it difficult for me to sleep, but I hated her enough that I was willing to live through the horror of it. I had a knife behind my back, and it was the only thing I could think of for a first strike. "Hey, David, I'm so sorry," she said when I ushered her into the house, and she stood at the door mewing. "Where is his body?" I asked her, as I marched closer to where she was. The tension of what I was about to do made me dizzy. "I had to make arrangements for a decent burial, David," she replied to me. I noticed the look of slight apprehension in her eyes, but it seemed uncertain, as though she was trying to judge my motive for moving towards her with my hands behind my back. I moved even quicker, desperate to stick the sharp end of my knife in her chest. Without uttering any word to what I had just said, I lunged on her with the knife drawn out, screeching loud. I struck once, aiming at her chest, but Becca's hands knocked my wrist, guiding the blade to her shoulders instead. I was caught up in the feverish frenzy of what I was doing, and in an out-of-body moment of excitement, I was delirious in my quest to murder her. "Ah!" she cried out in horror when my knife sunk into her arm. "Die, Becca, die!" I cried, struggling with the handle of the knife as I tried to snatch the blade out from her shoulders. She resisted me as much as she could and pushed me away. I fell on the floor, just right where I had planted one of the other knives that I had planned to use. I pulled it out, and I saw Becca gasp in horror, her eyes fluttering wide as she turned to flee. She put her hands out, and the second knife stabbed into her open palm. I yelled out in frustration. I hadn't done it before, but I knew stabbing someone in the chest was sure to kill them, and I wanted to kill Becca because she had taken Daniel from me. She took to her heels with one knife on her shoulder, and another knife stuck in her hand. "David, please stop!" she screeched in terror as she ran, horrified out of her mind. I scanned the room for the other places I had tucked knives in because I needed to finish her off. In my distraction, Becca reached the door quickly and was out on the street before I could find a knife. When I chased her out to the street, I saw that she had already alerted the neighbors, who were enough to resist me with placatory words, asking me to not continue with my actions, even as they called the cops and an ambulance for Becca, who was bleeding away. Becca made a full recovery with no permanent injuries, and I was arrested with a charge of attempting to murder her. It was 2 years since I had been put behind bars, and I still have nightmares about that moment.
This summer, I had to stay long-term at an Airbnb while my house was getting renovated. Even though it was a little more expensive than I'd hoped, I ended up staying at a pretty nice condo outside the city. It was part of a gated community with a pool and an exercise room. There were some long-term residents, but most of the people in the community were Airbnb renters like me. After I settled in and unpacked all my stuff, I met my next-door neighbors, a young couple named James and Pamela. They seemed nice enough, but I wasn't really in the mood to make friends while I was there. We talked for a bit, and then I went back inside. That night, I was having trouble sleeping. I'm used to having a very firm mattress in my house, but my new bed was almost laughably soft. I'd fall asleep for a few minutes and then wake up from pain in my lower back. It was around midnight when I noticed a movement through my window. I could see James and Pamela's house next door with their bedroom window directly facing mine. They had their blinds open, and I could see them standing in the room, arguing with each other. I knew I shouldn't look, but I had nothing else to do. Besides, they couldn't see me anyway. I watched as the couple got angrier and angrier at each other. Eventually, Pamela shoved James, and James shoved her back. I jumped out of my bed and ran to the window to get a better view. If things turned violent next door, I needed to be ready to call 911. Things very quickly turned violent. I saw James knock Pamela onto the ground. Then nothing happened for a long time. And then Pamela jumped back into view. She was holding a lamp against her chest. James said something to her, and she surged forward and swung the lamp against his head. He immediately collapsed onto the ground. After that, I couldn't see James through the window, but I saw Pamela slam the lamp, and I saw a splash of blood splatter against the window. I was too stunned to move. I know I should have hidden and called the police, but I'd never seen someone get murdered before. Then Pamela stood straight up, dropped the now broken lamp onto the ground, and turned right toward me. She knew I'd seen everything. She smiled at me. Finally overcoming my shock, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and called 911. In less than 5 minutes, a police car pulled up to my house, and I ran outside to greet them. 2 cops came out, and I told them everything in a single breath. The first cop wrote everything down, while the other glanced toward the house next door. I wasn't scared anymore. I knew that they'd find the body, take Pamela away, and everything would go back to normal. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. Right after I finished my explanation, the front door opened, and James stepped out. He was alive! He wiped the sleep out of his eyes and walked up to the cops as if nothing had happened. What's going on? Pamela joined them too. She apologized to the officers for wasting their time and explained that I must have had a bad dream or something. The cops were not happy. They told me that fake 911 calls were illegal and that I was lucky that they weren't going to arrest me. Then they got back in their car and left. Once the 3 of us were alone, Pamela started laughing. Works every time. She explained that she and her husband like to play jokes on their neighbors. They travel to new places and orchestrate morbid pranks, like fake murders, to see how people react. To prove her point, James pulled out a half-empty packet of fake blood that they'd used. Unlike his wife, though, James wasn't laughing. He seemed almost embarrassed by their prank. "No hard feelings, right?" Pamela asked. Annoyed and a little confused, I walked back inside without saying anything. Over the next few hours, I stopped thinking about my strange neighbors and tried to go back to sleep. It took a while, but I was finally able to doze off. I would have slept for the rest of the night, but a creaking noise woke me back up. I opened my eyes to see James opening my bedroom window and climbing inside. I knew this was another stupid prank, so I decided to confront him directly. "What the hell are you doing?" James explained that he was running away. He was done playing pranks with his wife. It was fun at first, but she'd taken things too far. He asked if I could help him, if he could hide out until the morning and then leave before Pamela found him. "No," I answered. "Good for you for changing your mind, but I'm staying out of it." He nodded sadly, and then started climbing back out through the same window. Suddenly, we heard noises coming from the other house. Pamela was awake. James dropped back into my bedroom and hid under the windowsill. Pamela turned on the light next door and looked into my window. "Hey!" she shouted. "Have you seen my husband?" "Please," James whispered from the floor. I almost ratted him out, but instead I lied and said he wasn't there. She looked at me for a long moment, trying to figure out if she could trust me. "Okay, but tell me if you do, please." Then she gave up and walked back into her house. "Can't you just talk to your wife?" I asked. "No," he answered sadly. "She always plays these morbid jokes where I get murdered, and it's all fun and games. But she told me that if I ever leave her, she'll kill me for real." Even though his expression seemed genuine, this still felt like another trick. I thought about kicking him out, but I decided not to. As long as he was gone in the morning, everything would be fine. Besides, if he tried to do anything, I'd wake up and stop him. "Fine," I told him. Lying on my carpet without any blanket or pillow, he closed his eyes and fell asleep. I leaned back on my pillow and improbably fell asleep. Nothing woke me up for the rest of the night. Eventually, I woke up to a loud banging sound. It was already morning and sunlight shined through the windows. I saw James's feet sticking out from the side of my bed, so I knew he was still asleep on my floor. The sound must have been someone else. Groggily, I got out of bed and stumbled toward the front door where the sound had come from. Just as I reached it, the door burst open and a policeman ran inside, his gun aimed at me. "Put your hands in the air!" I raised my arms, confused. "Get down on the ground, now!" the officer ordered. He was the same one from last night. I did what he said. While I was lying on the ground, the policeman charged in and went straight to my bedroom. I didn't move. From the other room, I could hear him calling in for backup. I stood up and walked toward the bedroom, my arms still raised. I looked into the room and saw the policeman crouched on the floor next to James. Poor James had a knife sticking out of his face. It wasn't a joke. He was definitely dead. His wife had killed him while I slept. It's a miracle she didn't wake me up. The policeman turned toward me. "You thought you'd cover your tracks by reporting a fake murder yesterday, didn't you? You knew you were going to kill this man, didn't you?" I had no idea what to say. Through the window, I could see Pamela waiting outside with another officer. He held her as she cried. "I didn't kill anyone!" I screamed. The policeman grabbed me and placed me in handcuffs. He read me my rights and took me away. As he guided me through the front door and into the police car, I could see Pamela watching us. She was still pretending to cry, but she stopped for a second to wink at me. "It was her!" I screamed. "She killed him!" The cop didn't believe me. He shoved me into the back seat. "Wait!" Pamela screamed. Then she walked over and told the cop that she wanted to see her husband's killer face to face. The cop stepped away and she leaned against the car window. "I'm sorry," she whispered to me. "This has nothing to do with you." Then she wordlessly walked back to the two policemen and told them to take me away. I'm on bail now, awaiting trial. Everyone thinks I'm guilty. Pamela planted enough evidence against me to put me away for a long time. When my trial comes, I'll finally be able to tell my side of the story. I pray that someone will believe me.
The first time we saw the house, it felt perfect. Quaint, nestled on the edge of town, with a wraparound porch and an old oak tree that made me think of lazy afternoons and lemonade. Mike loved it instantly too. We'd been looking for months, but this felt right. There was just one strange thing. Before we signed the papers, the realtor, a stern older woman with cold eyes, told us about the door in the basement. I remember the way her voice dropped when she said it. "Never open the door on Halloween night." I laughed at first. I mean, it sounded like something out of a bad horror movie, but she was dead serious. Mike gave her a look like she was crazy, but we didn't think much of it. It was just a locked door, probably a gimmick. Who cared, right? Halloween night came faster than we expected. We'd thrown a small party with some friends. Music was playing, drinks were flowing, and everyone was having a great time. It was perfect. It was just what we needed after the stress of the move. At some point, someone asked about the door. I don't even remember who brought it up, but the mood shifted when they did. The drinks made me braver, and maybe just dumber, but I was curious. I'd been curious about it since the day we moved in. We'd tried the handle when we first toured the house, but it had been locked tight. After the realtor's warning, we'd let it go. Until tonight. The others egged us on, laughing, teasing. Mike shook his head. "It's just an old door," he said. "Probably leads to a storage room or something." "Come on," I said, feeling bold with a glass of wine in my hand. "It's Halloween. What's the worst that could happen?" He sighed, but I could see it in his eyes. He was curious too. A part of him wanted to see what was behind that door just as much as I did. So, we all stumbled down into the basement, laughing and joking like idiots. The door was heavy, made of dark wood, worn and ancient. Mike found some old tools in the garage and, with a little force, managed to pry it open. When it creaked open, there was a moment of silence. The air was cold, colder than the rest of the basement, and there was a smell, musty, like something old and forgotten. The room beyond was pitch black. I felt a strange pull, a kind of dizziness, but I brushed it off as the alcohol. "Weird," someone said, breaking the silence. We laughed, but it was nervous laughter. Something felt off. We should have shut the door right then, but we didn't. We left it open. Later that night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, I started to feel strange. Mike was already asleep in bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I felt like I was being watched. My skin prickled as I lay next to him. Every sound in the house seemed amplified, like something was moving just beyond my line of sight. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as leftover anxiety from the party. But then it hit me. The smell. That musty, rotting smell from the basement. It was in our room now, heavy in the air. I sat up, my heart racing, and looked around. That's when I saw him. A man stood in the corner of the room, half shrouded in shadow. His eyes were dark, hollow. He wasn't Mike. He was someone else. Someone I didn't know. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to wake Mike, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. And then, he smiled. Everything that happened next was a blur, like I was trapped inside my own body, helpless as it moved without me. His hands touched me and I didn't stop him. I couldn't stop him. My skin burned under his touch, but I wasn't in control. It felt like someone else was pulling the strings, making me move, making me want him. I don't know how long it lasted. I remember flashes of him, his lips, the weight of his body against mine. And all I could do was watch from somewhere deep inside myself, unable to scream, unable to make it stop. I woke up the next morning with a splitting headache, the kind that digs into your skull and lingers. Mike wasn't beside me. The sheets were cold. My heart pounded as I remembered bits of the night before. The man, his touch, my betrayal. No, it couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of nightmare, a hallucination from drinks and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It had happened. I pulled myself out of bed, nausea swirling in my stomach, and wandered through the house looking for Mike. I found him in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table staring down at a crumpled piece of paper. He didn't look up when I came in. "Mike?" My voice cracked. Something was wrong, I could feel it. Without a word, he slid the note across the table towards me. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and distant. My stomach dropped as I read the words. "I know what you did. I saw everything." The room spun around me. My hands trembled. He knew. He had seen me with the man. But that couldn't be right. He was asleep, wasn't he? He hadn't been there. But the look in his eyes told me everything. I didn't mean to, Mike," I whispered, my voice shaking. I wasn't myself. I don't know what happened. I would never." "Stop," he said quietly. His voice was so cold, so dead. "I don't want to hear it." I reached out to get close to him, to explain, to beg him to understand that it hadn't been me. But he flinched away, pushing the chair back with a screech. His eyes were red, filled with tears he wouldn't let fall. And then, without another word, he stood up and left the room. The front door slammed shut behind him. I didn't see him for hours after that. I thought maybe he'd just gone for a drive to clear his head, to get away from me. I spent the day in a fog, barely able to breathe, replaying everything in my mind over and over. How could I have let that happen? How had I been so weak? I checked my phone obsessively, waiting for a text or call from Mike, but there was nothing. It wasn't until later, when the sun had started to set, that I realized something was really wrong. I searched the house, panic setting in, calling his name, but there was no answer. Finally, I found him. The bathroom door was locked. I pounded on it, screaming his name, begging him to open it. Silence. I don't remember how I broke it down, but when I did, I saw him. Mike was lying in the tub, his wrists open and bleeding into the water. His face was pale, his eyes closed, peaceful. He was gone. I screamed, but it felt distant. The sound was coming from someone else. It's been days now. I can't remember the last time I slept. Every time I close my eyes, I see him, Mike, and the man, the one who wasn't really a man at all. I know now. I know what we did. We opened that door, and whatever was behind it was still here. Inside me, if you know what I mean. It used me that night, made me do things I can't even comprehend. And now, Mike is gone because of me. Because we broke the rule. Who would have thought bad breath could kill a man? I mused this grimly, staring at the antiseptic glare of my bathroom mirror. Years of dental hygiene rituals, brushing, flossing, tongue scraping, all had been in vain. The sour odor persisted like a dark shadow haunting my interactions, poisoning my confidence. My now ex-girlfriend had been the latest to confirm my suspicions, sending me spiraling into a desperate quest for answers. Her words still stung, but they spurred me into action. I had always been meticulous about my oral hygiene. I saw my dentist religiously, brushed 3 times a day, flossed after every meal, and scrubbed my tongue till it bled. Yet the persistent white coating on my tongue never disappeared. My dentist had been baffled, offering no solution beyond more rigorous cleaning. It wasn't until I stumbled upon an obscure medical article online that I found a possible explanation: oral candiditis, a fungal infection that could cause chronic bad breath. Armed with this knowledge, I made an appointment with my doctor. Dr. Stevenson confirmed my self-diagnosis with a casual ease that made me question my years of suffering. "A week on these antifungal meds and you'll be as good as new," he said, scribbling on his prescription pad. His nonchalance infuriated me. How could something so debilitating be so easily dismissed? As I left the doctor's office, a sense of relief mingled with a simmering anger. Years of social anxiety, failed relationships, and shattered self-esteem, all because of a simple fungal infection. I started the medication that evening, vowing to reclaim my life. The next few days were surreal. The white coating on my tongue began to fade, and the rancid taste in my mouth dulled. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. But it wasn't just my breath that changed. Strange things started happening around me. I woke up one night to a whispering sound. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the remnants of a dream. But then I heard it again, a soft, unintelligible murmur emanating from the bathroom. I crept out of the bed and pushed open the door. The mirror was fogged up, and written in the condensation were the words, "Help me." I blinked, convinced I was still dreaming. I wiped the mirror clean and went back to bed, dismissing the incident as a figment of my exhausted mind. But the whispers continued over the next few nights, always coming from the bathroom, always at the same time. Unable to ignore it any longer, I set up a voice recorder before going to bed. The next morning, I played back the tape. Amidst the ambient noise, I heard it clearly, a faint, desperate voice whispering, "Help me." I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone or something was in my apartment. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That my bathroom mirror was haunted? I needed proof. That night, I set up a video camera. I didn't sleep, keeping one eye on the bathroom door. Around 3 a.m., the whispering started. I tiptoed to the bathroom, heart pounding, and flung open the door. The mirror was fogged up again, the words "help me" scrawled across it. But this time, there was something else. A face, faintly reflected in the glass, staring back at me. I stumbled back, tripping over the rug. The face was gone, but the message remained. I grabbed my phone and took a picture, my hand shaking. I needed to know what was happening. I spent the next day researching hauntings, trying to find a logical explanation. Everything pointed to a classic case of a restless spirit, but I wasn't ready to accept that. I decided to investigate the history of my apartment. At the local library, I uncovered a series of articles about a man named Henry Thompson who had lived in my apartment a decade ago. He was a recluse, rarely seen by neighbors. One day, a foul odor led the building superintendent to Henry's apartment, where he was found dead. The cause of death was ruled a suicide, but rumor suggested foul play. I returned home, determined to communicate with Henry. I set up my camera and sat in front of the mirror, speaking softly. "Henry, if you're here, I want to help you. What happened to you?" The whispers started again, more urgent this time. The mirror fogged up and a new message appeared. "Find the key." I searched the apartment, tearing through drawers and closets. In a dusty corner of the bedroom, I found a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a small, rusty key. I had no idea what it unlocked, but I was getting closer. That night, I set the key on the bathroom sink. "Henry, I found the key. What do I do with it?" The mirror fogged and a single word appeared. "Basement." I descended into the building's basement, the key clutched tightly in my hand. Among the old storage units, I found one with a padlock that matched the key. My heart raced as I turned the lock and opened the door. Inside was a small, dusty room filled with old furniture and boxes. In the corner, I found a stack of journals. They belonged to Henry, detailing his life and the events leading up to his death. He wrote about being tormented by a neighbor who wanted him out of the apartment. The final entry was a plea for help, dated the day before he died. I brought the journals to the police, who reopened the case. The neighbor was eventually arrested, and Henry's death was reclassified as a homicide. The restless spirit that had haunted my nights was finally at peace. The whispers stopped and my breath was fresh. With Henry's story told, I felt a sense of closure. My confidence returned and I began to rebuild my life. free from the shadow of bad breath and haunted mirrors. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror one last time, smiling at my reflection. "Thank you, Henry," I whispered. "Rest in peace." As I walked away, I glanced back. The mirror was clear, and for the first time in years, so was my mind.
Living in a small town in Oregon, I always felt secure. It was the kind of place where nobody locked their cars or houses. Life was slow, safe, and predictable, until the day my wallet disappeared. It had been sitting on my nightstand, and I tore my room apart looking for it. Nothing. I chalked it up to my absent-mindedness and tried to move on. Weeks later, I was getting ready for bed when I noticed a note in the bathroom, written in a cutesy font with little spirals around where the words were, "Mike says hello." At first, I didn't think much of it. One of my roommates, Sarah, always had friends over, so I figured it was just a playful note from one of them. I shrugged it off and went to bed. A week passed, and curiosity got the better of me. I asked Sarah if anyone knew someone named Mike. She looked at me puzzled and said, "No, I thought it was one of your friends. I don't know anyone named Mike." Her response sent a chill down my spine. If it wasn't a friend, then who had been in the house? 2 days later, around midnight, I stepped outside to smoke a cigarette. The air was crisp, and the street was empty, except for a shadowy figure standing across the road, staring straight at me. My heart started to race. I took a few steps forward and shouted, Hey, who are you?" The figure didn't respond, but instead turned around and walked away into darkness. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. On a hunch, I decided to check on the grill in the backyard. I rarely used it, but something told me to look inside. Lifting the lid, my jaw dropped. Sitting there, neatly in the center, was my wallet, completely untouched. I had used the grill since losing my wallet. How had it gotten there? From that day on, I started locking the doors, but the unease lingered. I kept replaying the events in my head. The missing wallet, the strange note, the staring figure, the reappearance of my wallet. It all felt connected. I decided to dig deeper. I began by asking around town for any unusual occurrences. It was then that I heard about Mike. He had been a resident of our town, a regular guy, until he vanished one day without a trace. The police had no leads, and his disappearance remained a mystery. The more I learned, the more it felt like that his disappearance and my experiences were connected. One night I was in the kitchen, and I heard a soft knock at the door. I peeked through the window and saw a middle-aged woman standing on the porch. Cautiously, I opened the door. "Are you Alex?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah, that's me. Who are you?" I replied, equally cautious. "My name is Karen. I'm Mike's sister. I think you might be in danger." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I invited her in and we sat down at the kitchen table. Karen explained that Mike had been investigating a series of strange events in town before he disappeared. He believed someone was watching him, and shortly before he vanished, he left a note for Karen saying, "If something happens to me, tell Alex." "But why me?" I asked. She claimed that she didn't know. She said that she found my address in his things and thinking that it might have been a warning for me. As Karen spoke, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Mike had been onto something, or someone, and now that person was targeting me. But why? I needed answers. Over the next few days, I started noticing things around the house. Small items were moved, doors left ajar, the feeling of being watched. I knew I had to confront whoever was behind this. I set up a camera in the living room, hoping to catch the intruder. One night, I was reviewing the footage. Then I saw it. A man, tall and thin, entered the house through the back door. He moved with a disturbing familiarity, as if he knew the layout of our home. He stopped in front of the camera, looked directly into it, and mouthed the words, Mike says hello. I called the police, showing them the footage. They took the report seriously and started an investigation, but the intruder remained elusive. One evening, I got a call from an unknown number. A deep voice on the other side said, "Meet me at the old factory outside of town if you want answers." The line went dead. I knew it was risky, but I had to go. I drove to the factory, my heart pounding. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. As I stepped deeper into the shadows, a figure emerged. "Who are you?" I demanded. The man stepped out of the light, revealing a scarred face. "My name is Sam." Mike was my partner. We were investigating a corrupt group of individuals in this town. They took Mike when he got too close. And now they're after you. "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked. "They have connections everywhere. Trust no one," Sam warned. "Mike left clues for you. Find them, and you'll uncover the truth." With Sam's help, I began to piece together Mike's investigation. We discovered that the town's seemingly perfect facade hid a dark secret. A network of corruption involving prominent town members. The final clue led us to a hidden room in the basement of Town Hall. Inside, we found documents detaining illegal activities and evidence that linked back to the powerful individuals in town. We had enough to expose them. With the evidence in hand, we went to state authorities. The ensuing investigation led to arrests and a massive cleanup of the town's corrupt elements. In the aftermath, I reflected on how my safe, predictable life had been shattered, only to reveal the truth underneath the surface. Mike's disappearance had not been in vain. His determination had discovered a web of lies, and his clues led me to the truth. As I stood on my porch, watching the sunset, I felt a sense of closure. The town was safer now. Last September, my husband Joe bought himself a motorcycle. It was definitely a midlife crisis decision. He had just turned 60. I begged him not to. I literally showed him motorcycle accident videos on my phone, but he wouldn't hear me out. I eventually made him a promise that if he always wore his helmet, which wasn't required in our state, that I would do the best that I would do to accept it. Thankfully, he didn't go for long rides, just a couple hours at a time. But whenever he was gone, I turned into a nervous wreck. Joe was the sweetest, most genuine person you ever met, and I was terrified of losing him. One evening, he went for a ride before dinner. It started raining about 20 minutes after he left. Very soon, the rain turned into a full-on monsoon. I could see the trees shaking wildly through the windows. Joe had never driven his motorcycle in bad weather before, so I prayed that he came back right away. After an hour, he wasn't back. I didn't know at the time, but Joe actually tried to return home. He was 2 minutes away from our house when he skidded over a pothole and lost control of his bike. He was passing the local cemetery at the time. His front tire jammed into the pothole, and his body was thrown into the air and over the cemetery wall. He slammed against a headstone and passed out. A passing driver called 911, and Joe was taken to the hospital. A nurse called me and told me to come immediately. When I got there, Joe was lying in his bed. Doctors told me that he was extremely lucky. He had sprained his wrist and cracked 2 ribs, but otherwise unharmed. They did all the brain scan stuff and couldn't find any signs of a concussion. I cried in relief. The doctor left the room, and I asked Joe how he was feeling. "I could use a cigarette," he muttered. Joe hadn't smoked since he was a teenager, and I wasn't about to let him restart. I told him no, and he threw a bedpan at me. That was very unlike him. I ran out of the room and pulled the doctor aside. "Doctor, are you sure he doesn't have any brain trauma?" He told me that they triple-checked everything. I described Joe's sudden change in personality, and the doctor said that outbursts were normal after an accident. I didn't have anything to worry about. I didn't believe him, though. Joe stayed at the hospital overnight. I was planning to sleep on the chair in his room, but he ordered me to leave. The next morning, I went back to pick him up. and he was still in a foul mood. The only time he talked on a long drive back home was when we were passing the cemetery. He pointed out where the accident had happened. I saw the headstone that he struck was cracked in two. After that, he didn't say anything. For the next 5 days, I tried to take care of Joe at home. I brought him his meals in bed and made sure that he walked enough each day. The whole time, he was openly rude to me. Foods that he used to like suddenly tasted horrible. He didn't even want to sleep in the same bed as me, so I moved into the guest room. There were other changes too. He kept demanding cigarettes until I had to drive to his store. Very soon, our bedroom reeked of smoke. He started using different words. He asked for a pop, even though he always said soda. He sneezed when our cat was around, even though he never had allergies before. And strangest of all, he started calling me Gloria, which wasn't my name at all. At first, I thought it was a joke, but no. He genuinely thought my name was Gloria. I corrected him the first few times, but after a while I started answering to it. Eventually I had enough. He never acted like this before. Something happened to his brain during the crash. I told Joe that I was taking him back to the hospital. That was a statement, and I wasn't backing down. Slowly he pushed himself out of bed and limped towards me. I thought he was finally listening to reason until he grabbed my shoulders. "I'm not going back there, Gloria," he yelled in my face. Then he pushed me against the wall. His face was twisted into pure hatred. I ran. Joe chased me out the room and into the hall. I screamed the whole time. He carried his lunch tray with him, wielding it like a weapon. I tried to dive into the bathroom and lock the door behind me, but he was too fast. He yanked me back into the hallway and dragged me toward the balcony. I tried to pull free, but he whacked me with the tray. Once we were on the balcony, he closed the door behind us and let me go. He casually tossed the tray over the edge and watched it fall. "Jump with me, Gloria." Our house was 2 stories tall, but our balcony looked pretty steep over the ravine. If we jumped, we would most likely die. He held out his hand as an invitation. "Please." I pretended to reach for his hand, and then I pushed him out of the way and ran back inside. I locked the balcony door. He pounded on the glass, but I wouldn't let him in. Then he just stopped and sat on the ledge staring at me, seemingly giving up. I ran into the other room and grabbed my phone, but when I came back, the balcony was empty. I opened the door and looked down into the ravine, but I couldn't see his body. Did he climb down the wall? Was that even possible? I went downstairs and looked all around the house, but he was gone. I got into my car and drove around the neighborhood looking for him. It was the middle of the night, and I didn't see anything in our dark street. I was too afraid to go back home, so I decided to keep driving and go to the police station for help. On my way, I passed the cemetery. I saw the still broken headstone, but this time, there was an old woman standing in front of it. I don't know why, but something compelled me to stop the car and talk with her. I parked a few feet away and joined her in the cemetery. The name broken on the headstone was Joseph, just like my husband. I introduced myself to the woman and asked her why she was here. "I heard my ex-husband's grave was defaced. I had to see it for myself," she said. "I'm so sorry about that." "Don't be," she explained. "I'm glad it's broken." She said that her dead husband was violent, a chain-smoking psychopath. He spent the last 3 years of his life in a hospital for the criminally insane. He was a terrible person. I told him I would never be putting my name next to his. I asked her what her name was. She turned to me, looked me dead in my eyes, and told me. Her name was Gloria. As Gloria talked, all I could think about was my Joe. This woman's dead husband sounded exactly what my husband was going through, how he acted. Had the spirit of this man possessed Joe? That would explain all his changes. Then again, so would a concussion. Eventually, I told myself that I was reading too much into things. Ghosts weren't real. Dead people couldn't possess you. It was all a weird coincidence. The woman asked me why I'd come, and I told her for no reason. Then I waved to her and left. To this day, my husband is still missing. The police searched the area around my house, including the ravine, but they couldn't find him. I don't expect to ever see Joe again. But if you do, I don't think it's him anymore. Martin and I divorced last August. We'd been married for a year, but it just wasn't working out. I still loved him, but I could no longer look past his flaws. He was a slacker. He never took anything seriously. I thought that as we got older, he'd start to mature. He'd get a better job, do more of the cooking, pick up after himself. You know, basic stuff that you would expect from a husband. But nope. He was the same lazy goofball that he'd been in college. I didn't see him as the kind of person I could eventually raise children with. So I asked for a separation. We lived apart for a couple months, and hopefully he'd get his act together. I didn't tell him exactly what I wanted from him. He needed to figure that out by himself. By the time Halloween rolled around, we'd been living apart for 3 months. During that time, he hadn't contacted me once. At times, it was nice to have the house to myself, but for Halloween night, I really wanted him there with me. I was home alone, passing out candy to trick-or-treaters. Most of the neighborhood kids were super cute, but it wasn't fun without Martin beside me. He loved Halloween more than any other holiday, and even though his childishness usually annoyed me, Halloween was the one time of year that I really missed that part of him. Eventually, the trick-or-treaters stopped coming. I started picking up all my leftover candies when one last trick-or-treater knocked on my door. He was dressed in an expensive-looking pirate costume. He wasn't a kid, though. He looked older than me. He even had stubble on his chin. No one that old should be going door to door asking for candy. "Trick or treat," he said in a deep voice. I asked him how old he was, and he just repeated, "Trick or treat." I should have just given him the candy, but I didn't. I told him that he was too old and then closed the door on him. He didn't say anything, and when I looked through the peephole, he was silently leaving my porch with his head lowered in embarrassment. Once he was gone, I shut off the porch light and deadbolted the door. Halloween was officially over. I started watching some dumb horror movie on TV, wondering what Martin was doing for the holiday. Suddenly, the TV shut off by itself, and all the lights went out too. I looked out the window and saw that the house across the street had all their lights still on. This wasn't a blackout. Someone might have messed with my fuse box. Obviously, it could have been a prank, but I immediately thought about the pirate. I didn't know for sure, but I assumed that he was trying to get back at me for sending him away without candy. Any full-grown adult man who goes trick-or-treating by himself would be capable of something like that. The fuse box was outside my garage, and if a man was still out there, I didn't want to go outside. And also, I didn't want to sit in complete darkness while some creep was wandering around. So what should I do? I decided to call the police, but I couldn't find my phone in my pocket. I must have left it somewhere near the front door, but it was too dark for me to find it. Slowly, fear began to set in. I wished Martin was here. For the first time since our separation, I really, truly needed him. A loud, shattering sound rose up behind me. Someone had thrown one of my decorative rocks through the window, shooting shards of glass everywhere. I jumped off my feet. There was a man outside the broken window looking right at me. I couldn't see his face, though. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, even though it was a lie. If only I could find my phone. The man disappeared from the window. There was silence for a long moment. All I heard was my heartbeat. And wham! Another rock hurled through my front window. This time I was close enough to feel shards of glass pelt my shoulder. I could deal with that later, but right now, I had to get out of the house. Fast. I ran to my back door and flung it open. I looked both ways, trying to catch a glimpse of my attacker, and decided to go right. There were fewer trees on that side, so I'd have a straight shot to the road. I rounded the corner and tripped over something, landing hard on both of my hands. My left wrist made a horrible snapping noise, though I didn't feel any pain. I think my adrenaline was pumping too hard. I scrambled to my feet and saw exactly what I tripped over. It was that pirate laying dead on the ground. A bloody rock sat next to his cratered head, barely able to breathe. I stumbled backwards, colliding against another man standing right behind me. He grabbed me by the shoulders and spun me around to face him. "Martin?" He wrapped me in a big hug and asked if I was okay. I felt so safe in his arms, until the realization hit me. "You killed him," as I said as I pushed him back. He didn't deny it. He explained that he'd seen the guy sneaking through my yard and breaking my windows, so he sprang into action. He made it sound like he was this big hero who'd come to rescue me. And in a way, he was. He murdered this man for me. I spat onto the ground and ran away from him. He saved my life, so I wasn't going to tell the police. But I also wouldn't get back together with him. He scared me now. The next morning, the body was gone, and I never saw Martin again. Our separation had become permanent. It was one of those mornings where everything felt slightly off-kilter. The kind of morning where the coffee tastes a little different, the air tastes a little thicker, and reality seems to bend at the edges. As I sat in my recliner, cradling my mug and trying to shake off the remnants of sleep, I saw my boyfriend, Jake, walk by in his work clothes, heading toward the bathroom. "Good morning," I called out, but he didn't respond. Maybe he didn't hear me, or perhaps he was in one of those pre-coffee grumpy moods. I shrugged it off and sipped my coffee, letting the warm sip into my bones. A few minutes later, I heard the front door open. Jake walked back into the house, his face a mix of frustration and haste. He had his phone in hand, clearly had forgotten something. I watched as he headed toward the bedroom again, but something was wrong. He was wearing a completely different outfit than he had just moments before. My mind was racing, trying to piece together with incongruity. "Jake, you were just in the bedroom, weren't you?" I asked, my voice tinged with confusion. He paused, giving me a puzzled look. No, I was outside cleaning the car. I forgot my phone," he said, holding it up as evidence. "But I just saw you walk by in different clothes," I stammered, my grip tightening on my coffee mug. Jake frowned, clearly trying to understand what I was saying. "Babe, I haven't been inside since I left. Maybe you were just seeing something." I wanted to believe him, but unease gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I finished my coffee, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or perhaps my sleep-deprived brain was playing tricks on me. The day passed in a blur of mundane tasks and work obligations, but the morning's events lingered at the back of my mind. By the time evening rolled around, I was eager to put the whole thing behind me. Jake and I settled on the couch and watched a movie, hoping to unwind and forget about the odd start of our day. But as the night wore on, the sense of unease only grew. I found myself glancing toward the bedroom, half expecting to see Jake walk by in a different outfit again. It wasn't until we were getting ready for bed that I finally decided to bring it up again. "Jake, about this morning, it really freaked me out," I admitted as we climbed into bed. "I know what I saw." He turned to me, his expression softening. "I don't know what to tell you. I mean, maybe it was just a weird coincidence or something. Better not to dwell on it, okay?" I nodded, but feeling uneasy. I drifted off to sleep, hoping that a good night's rest would help me clear my mind. The next morning, I woke up feeling more refreshed than unsettled, but still a bit uneasy. Jake had already left for work. I found myself alone with my thoughts. I decided to shake off the lingering dread by going for a run. The crisp morning air helped clear my mind, and by the time I returned home, I felt a bit more grounded. As I walked through the front door, I noticed something odd. Jake's work boots were by the door, but they were muddy, as if he had been outside in the rain. But it hadn't rained in days. I frowned, trying to make sense of it. The day passed uneventfully, but the mystery of the muddy boots and strange outfit change gnawed at me. That evening, as Jake and I sat down for dinner, I decided to confront him again. Jake, something weird is going on. Your boots were muddy this morning, and it hadn't rained in days. And the outfit thing, I just can't ignore it. He looked at me, his brow furrowing in concern. I don't know what to say, babe. Maybe you're overthinking things, but let's just try to relax and maybe not stress about it. I wanted to believe that, but the pieces just weren't adding up. And we were settling in for another night. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface. That night I had a dream. I was back in the recliner sipping my coffee, and Jake walked by in his work clothes again. But this time, he stopped and looked at me, his eyes filled with an eerie intensity. "You're not supposed to see this," he said, his voice low and unsettling. I jolted awake, heart pounding. My room was dark and silent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over at Jake, who was sleeping peacefully beside me. The next morning, I woke up, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. As I sat in my recliner, coffee in hand, I saw Jake walk by again. My heart raced, but this time, I followed him. He headed toward the bedroom just like before. "Jake," I called out, but he didn't respond. I watched as he walked through the bedroom door, and I followed him steps behind. But when I reached the bedroom, it was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned around, only to find Jake standing behind me, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on?" he asked. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I saw you walk into the bedroom, but you weren't there. And this happened before. I don't know what's happening, but it's freaking me out." Jake looked at me, his eyes searching in mine. "Look, I believe you, okay?" he said softly. "Maybe there's something more going on here." We spent the next few days trying to piece together the mystery. We researched everything from sleepwalking to parallel universes, and nothing seemed to fit. It was only then that we decided to explore the house for something. Upon looking into the attic, it was then that we stumbled upon an old journal hidden in the attic that we finally found at least some answers. The journal belonged to the previous owner of the house, a man named Henry who had experienced similar strange occurrences. His writings detailed sightings of his own doppelganger with an eerie feeling of being watched. He believed that the house was built on a ley line, a place where boundaries between realities were thin. As we read through the journal, everything started to make sense, but also confused us at the same time. The strange outfit changes, the muddy boots, the feeling of being watched. It was all connected to the house and its unique location. With this newfound understanding, we decided to embrace the mystery rather than fear it. We learned to live with the occasional oddity, and in time, the strange occurrences became less frequent. Our love for each other grew stronger as we faced the unknown together, finding comfort in the fact that we weren't alone.
I clicked on the lights in my office and sat down with a grumbled sigh, still half asleep. It was barely past 7 o'clock in the morning, but I'd had an urgent email come through from a potential client, and I had to drag myself to work to check it out. As a private investigator on the higher end of the scale, it was only expected of me to be on call at all times, even this early in the morning. I checked the email while I waited for the coffee machine to kick in, scanning my eyes several times over the text until I had all the details. Rich family, missing kid. That was the general gist of it. Though the family name made me do a double take. The Reynolds. Everyone knew the Reynolds for their lavish lifestyle and perfect family. They were a pillar of the community. Although they exuded wealth, they did their part to donate to charity and uphold a likable public image. It was the youngest son and heir to their massive wealth who had gone missing, a young man by the name of Jason Reynolds. As far as I recalled from seeing him in the media, he was the family's golden child, the smart and successful one who had practically usurped all of his older siblings as the favorite. After I accepted the job and received my initial payment, I kicked off the preliminary investigation into Jason's disappearance. The first point of call was to track his last known whereabouts and liaisons, and determine who had seen him last and where. From there, I could start to build a picture of what might have happened in the time afterwards. I spent the next few days interviewing everyone who was part of his personal life, from his parents to his siblings to the serving and cleaning staff that resided in their family home. They all said a similar thing. Nobody had seen Jason since he left the house alone late one Friday evening. He hadn't told anyone where he was going, and he had hired a cab instead of taking their private chauffeur. It was Jason's mother, Julia, who caught my interest the most. She answered all my questions in a similar manner to the others, but as we were leaving, she looked as though she was about to say something else. "Is there something on your mind?" I prompted when she hesitated, her gaze flicking up to meet mine before darting away again. Definitely a sign that she was hiding something. No, it's fine. Please, just find my son," was all she said before flicking her wrist for one of the staff members to show me out. I watched her go, curiously, and then I made a mental note of it before leaving. Whatever she was hiding, it would come to light eventually. That was my job, after all, discovering all the secrets that people wanted to keep hidden. With the interviews not giving me much to go on, I instead turned my focus to figuring out where the cab had taken him on Friday evening. There was a reason he hadn't taken the family's driver. He didn't want anyone to know where he was going. According to his older sister, she'd seen him climb into a cab from a local company who had an office not too far away from my own. Since it was my only lead for the moment, I decided to pursue it and paid a visit to the cab company's headquarters. "Excuse me, does anyone recognize this young man?" I asked, showing the picture of Jason to the drivers. One of them spoke up from the back after studying the picture closely. "Yeah, I know him. Took him someplace downtown on Friday night. I remember because he tipped real well." That sounded like Jason. "Do you remember the name of the place you dropped him off?" The man nodded and scribbled something down on a piece of paper. An address. "Thanks, you've been a great help," I told him before climbing back into my car and heading to the location that the driver had taken him. The address ended up belonging to a shady-looking bar in the downtown area of the city. Judging by the folks hanging around the street corners, it definitely wasn't somewhere the son of a rich family should be visiting on a Friday night. What had he been doing all the way out here? It was looking to me like perhaps he was involved in business he shouldn't be. Business that would definitely ruin his and his family's reputation if it were to go public. The Reynolds' golden boy wasn't perhaps as charming and innocent as he had everyone believing. I spoke to the people inside the club and followed the further clues they provided, until I came across a name of interest. Peter Lotz. According to one of the witnesses, they had seen Peter confront Jason outside the bar before the two of them had left together. With this information, I finally had a key suspect in Jason's disappearance. While searching for Peter's whereabouts, I did some digging into his life to see if he had any connection to Jason that I could use to fuel the investigation. According to some obscure articles I found online, Peter had lost his daughter some months ago. Now, while some sources posited it as an accident, there were others that were ruling foul play, specifically murder. By then, I was starting to formulate a potential series of events that had led to Jason's disappearance. If he was involved in some dangerous business, well, then murder wouldn't be too far off that list either. Was that what his mother had been hiding? Had she known that her son was somehow involved with dangerous people? Had she known what he'd done? By the time we tracked Peter down, it was already too late. We found Jason's body in the basement, his corpse cold and bloody. "He deserved it," Peter kept muttering once the police came to arrest him. "He deserved it. He had it coming. He deserved it. He deserved it all." Later, after managing to get a coherent statement from Peter, he told us he had kidnapped and killed Jason in retaliation for Jason murdering his daughter in a drug deal gone wrong. Jason's mother had paid him a large sum of money to keep quiet about the fact, but the guilt and lack of justice had driven him to take things into his own hands. In the end, it was Jason's own actions and his mother's attempts to hush it up that had gotten him killed.
My roommate Jed and I were supposed to go to a costume party last Halloween in some house near campus. Jed was going to be Tarzan because he just lost a bunch of weight and wanted to show off. I was going to be a ninja, the same costume I'd worn the last 3 years. I was all set to go when Jed casually mentioned that my ex Tristan would be there. I did not want to be anywhere near that psycho, so I told him I wouldn't go. He went without me. He ended up switching into my ninja costume at the last minute because he was feeling self-conscious about showing so much in his Tarzan suit. Before he left, he told me he wouldn't stay too long at the party. He didn't like Tristan either. He'd rather spend Halloween with me. So he said he would come back early and we'd go to a club instead. He still wanted to make an appearance at the party though. I waited 3 hours, but he didn't come back. I texted to ask if he changed his mind, but he didn't respond. I stayed up all night worrying about him. I hoped he'd found some girl and just forgot to text me, but deep down, I felt that something had happened to him. The next morning, he still hadn't answered any of my texts, so I decided to go to the house where the party had been. It was a nice house in a nice neighborhood, though the front yard was covered in empty cups and beer cans. I knocked on the front door, and guess who answered? Tristan. She was visibly hungover. I hated seeing her again. I vowed to myself right after our breakup that I'd avoid Tristan at all costs, and now I was breaking that rule. My roommate was missing, and I was desperate. I had to talk to her. Before I could ask my first question, Tristan already knew what I was going to say. Jed never showed up last night. I assume that's why you're here. Are you sure? I asked. We had a couple dozen people here, she explained. But no ninjas. Sorry. She started to close the door in my face, but I stopped it with my foot. I asked her how she knew what costume Jed was wearing. He hadn't decided to borrow my costume until right before the party, but she couldn't have known that. Tristan mumbled out some excuse, but I didn't pay attention. As she was talking, I pulled out my phone and dialed Jed's number. Immediately, his phone started to ring somewhere inside the house. She instantly stopped talking. She knew she'd been caught in a lie. Damn it, she shouted, then pulled me inside and slammed the door behind me. She wasn't the only one in the house. Her new boyfriend was there too. He was huge, 6'2" and at least 300 pounds. As Tristan took my phone out of my hands, this man grabbed me by the shirt and pulled me across the room. I struggled to break free, but he was too strong. He opened the door to the basement and threw me down the stairs. Then he slammed the door shut behind me, leaving me in total darkness. I fumbled against the walls until I found the light switch. When I turned it on, I saw Jed lying dead on the ground. He was still in his ninja costume. I could hear voices through the door. Tristan and her boyfriend were discussing what to do with me. From what I could hear, I pieced together what had happened the night before. Tristan and her boyfriend had planned to murder me at the party. And they'd succeeded. The only problem was that Jed was wearing my costume, so they'd murdered the wrong person. Now that they had me trapped, they'd finally be able to finish the job. I looked all around the basement for a way to escape. There was only one window big enough for me to crawl through, but it was painted shut. The basement was completely empty, so I didn't have anything to break the window. Then I looked at poor dead Jed. His costume included ninja stars hanging from the belt. They were real metal and pretty sharp. I took one and broke the window just as Tristan's boyfriend was walking down the stairs. Acting fast, I climbed through the broken glass. I was halfway out of the window when the man grabbed my feet and pulled me back inside. Shards of glass cut across my stomach. I fell back onto the basement floor. The man stood over me, looking absolutely massive. He didn't need any weapons to kill me. He grabbed my throat and squeezed. I couldn't breathe. Behind my attacker, Tristan had entered the basement. She was just there to watch. And as her boyfriend strangled me, she broke out in a huge grin. Thankfully, I still had the ninja star in my hand. I gripped it tight, the sharp edges cutting into my palm. Then I waved my arm forward and slashed him across the chest. I only cut him a little, but it was enough to make him lose his grip on my neck. As he stumbled backwards, I went back to the broken window and climbed out. Tristan screamed at me as I climbed onto the front yard and raced to my car. I drove a safe distance away and called the cops. By the time they arrived, Tristan and her boyfriend were gone. They'd left Jed's body behind. The doctors had to stitch up the cuts along my stomach, but other than that, I was okay. The same couldn't be said for Jed, though. I still feel guilty that my friend had been killed in my place, but I'm mostly scared that one day, Tristan and her boyfriend will come back for me.
Last Halloween, my dorm mate Lauren forced me to go with her to a party at one of her sorority houses. She knew that Greek party stuff wasn't really my thing, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. We got a late start, mostly because Lauren kept changing her outfit. Then we started to walk across the long campus. I was surprised at how quiet and empty it was. For most of our walk, we didn't see anyone. We reached the arts building and just passed the quad. There was a woman in a white dress standing on the stairs, nervously looking around. Then, out of nowhere, a man in a black mask came up behind her and stabbed her with a knife. At least, I think it was a knife. We were too far away. She collapsed onto the steps and he stabbed her again. She let out a piercing "help." Without thinking, I started running towards the commotion. Lauren grabbed my arm to stop me. I tried to reason with her, but she said it's not real. They're just doing a performance art. She had a point. Students in our school arts program always did bizarre stunts at the end of the semester. Last year, a group of them disrupted our final exams with a massive flash mob across the campus. The semester before that, they hid bags of fake money throughout the quads and filmed their reactions. If you ask me, I didn't like these stunts, as I didn't think of them as performances at all. They were just pranks. But none of the pranks were like this. This was a murder scene. It didn't look fake at all. The poor woman was screaming bloody murder, and even though she was pretty far, I could see blood dripping down the stairs. Blood definitely looking real. I should have pulled out of Lauren's grasp. I should have run to the woman, but without Lauren's support, I didn't have the confidence to do it alone. Eventually, I gave in and we both left. Once we got to the Halloween party, I couldn't enjoy myself. I kept thinking about that woman. Lauren immediately left to go hook up with some guy that I didn't know. I tried to have a good time, but after about an hour, I gave up and went back home. I didn't even tell Lauren I was leaving. On my long walk back home, I was pretty nervous. The campus seemed completely empty. As I walked, I looked around every shadow, worried that the killer might come back. But when I walked past the arts building again, I couldn't find any signs of murder. No blood, no body, nothing. Somehow that just made my paranoia worse. I got back to my dorms and turned on the lights. It would have helped if there were other people in the dorms, but the building was just empty. By the middle of the night, I heard someone moaning softly in the hallway. I peered through the peephole in my door, and I saw the murdered woman. Still covered with blood. Even though she couldn't see me through the peephole, somehow I knew that we were looking directly at each other. She reached towards the door with her bloody hands. Why didn't you save me? I frantically unlocked the door, but when I opened it, she was gone. The next morning, I convinced myself that it was just a dream, that no one got murdered, no one was haunting me. But then the next night, she came back. This time, Lauren was in the dorm with me. She was watching something on her computer. The same moaning came from the hallway. I raced to the door and looked outside. Once again, the woman was there, reaching towards with her same bloody hands and the same horrible question. Why didn't you save me? I asked Lauren if she heard it too, but she was wearing ear pods and couldn't hear anything. I had to physically shake her shoulders to get her attention. "That dead woman is back," I told her. But when she went to see for herself, the ghost woman had disappeared. "Very funny," Lauren said, thinking I was messing with her. "You're worse than those art students." I explained everything to her, about seeing her last night too, but she wasn't convinced. We argued about it, but Lauren started teasing me about believing in ghosts. She said she would only believe if she saw the ghost for herself. No one else was in our dorm. No one else saw what we saw. And believe me, I asked everyone. I checked the local news too. No one had gone missing. The only news I found for Halloween night involved drunk and disorderly frat guys. For the next week, I saw the bloody woman 3 more times, just outside my dorm room, and twice on my walk across campus. All 3 times, she was bloody and desperate. All 3 times, no one else saw her. I began to lose hope that I'd get any answers. Deep down, I figured all these sightings were just manifestations of my guilt. I saw a murder and I didn't stop it. Whether or not the murder was real, my guilt certainly was. The most frustrating part about this whole thing was that Lauren, who literally had seen the stabbing with me, didn't believe me at all. Every time I brought it up, she told me the murder was fake and ghosts weren't real. As someone who never believed in the supernatural before, it was hard for me to argue. Then, one night, 1 week after Halloween, I saw the ghost woman one last time. She was back in the dorm hallway, scratching on my door and moaning the same accusation. Lauren was in her bedroom, but I knew that if I ran to get her, the ghost would disappear once more. I opened the door and finally, I could see the ghost face to face. She wasn't translucent or anything. She looked like a real person covered in blood. "I'm so sorry," I told her. "I should have saved you." The ghost seemed surprised for a second, especially to how fast I pushed open the door. She involuntarily stepped backwards, though her hands were still outstretched. "What do you want?" I asked. "How can I help you cross over?" She backed up even further, the look of confusion on her ghostly face. She didn't know what to say. "It's okay," I told the ghost as calmly as I could. "Tell me what you want." She backed up just 1 more step, but unfortunately too far. The stairs were right behind her. She overstepped just a couple inches, slipping off the top of the stairs and fell backwards. I watched in horror as she fell down the flight of stairs and landed in a heap next to the floor. Her body made an awful crunch as it struck every step on the way down. A trickle of blood oozed out of her mouth, but it was a different color from the bloodstains on her shirt. She looked up at me, unable to move her head. Slowly, she mumbled out her dying words. It was just performance art.
I didn't mean to kill her. Not at first, anyway. But that's what happened. A moment of jealousy, a heated argument, and suddenly everything I had worked for was in danger. Zara West was the biggest influencer in the city. A flawless beauty with millions of followers. We were neck and neck, competing for the same deals, the same sponsorships, the same followers. But no matter what I did, Zara was always 1 step ahead. It was maddening. That night, when I cornered her in the stairwell after the event, I just wanted to scare her, make her back off. But she laughed at me. Laughed like I was nothing, a joke. That's when I shoved her, harder than I realized. I didn't see her head hit the concrete until it was too late. The pool of blood, the way her eyes fluttered shut. It was quick, like flipping a switch. No one ever suspected it was me. Zara had plenty of enemies. But I knew what I'd done. And someone else knew, too. Gerald, my creepy neighbor. He had always been lurking, watching me through his half-cracked door as I left for shoots, as I came back from events. I used to think he was just some sad, lonely guy, but he wasn't. He was worse. He was a vulture, circling above, waiting for his chance to feed. It was a month after Zara's death when the first note arrived. I know what you did. The words were scrawled in red ink, tucked under my door. My heart stopped when I read it. Who could possibly know? I had been so careful. There were no witnesses, no cameras. But then the second note came, and this time it was more specific. I saw you that night. You pushed her. Panic set in and I could barely breathe. Gerald knocked on my door that evening. A slow, deliberate knock that sent chills down my spine. I didn't want to open it, but I had no choice. He stood there, smiling, holding the note in his hand. "You've got a real problem on your hands," he said casually, leaning against the door frame like we were old friends. "Lucky for you, I'm a man who values discretion." What do you want?" I managed to ask, though my voice trembled. He didn't say money. That would have been too easy. Instead, he leaned in close, his breath hot and stale on my cheek. "You'll bring me something of yours once a week. Something personal, expensive. I've seen your Instagram. I know what kind of things you wear." I felt sick. It wasn't just blackmail, it was perversion. He wanted my lingerie. My life, my career, everything I had worked for was at his mercy. And the price he demanded was humiliating. I didn't have a choice. I had killed someone, and he knew. So, for months, I complied. Every week, I'd deliver a set of my used lingerie to his apartment. Each time, I hated myself a little more. It wasn't just the act of giving him something so intimate. It was the way he'd look at me when he took it from my hands, like he owned me. I thought about running, but where would I go? I couldn't just leave my life behind. My millions of followers, my brand deals, my image, it was all I had. And if Gerald ever decided to expose me, it would all come crashing down. No one would ever see me as anything other than a murderer. But the shame wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how his demands kept growing. First it was 1 piece a week, then 2. Then he wanted specific pieces. The ones from my most expensive shoots, the ones that cost thousands. It was draining me financially, and each week I felt my control slipping further and further away. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I knew I had to stop him. And I found a way. This week was different. This week, I delivered my final set. It was a custom-made, high-end piece from my last big campaign. Delicate lace, hand-stitched with gold accents. Beautiful. But there was something else sewn into the seams. A poison. Tasteless, odorless, lethal. It would absorb through his skin the moment he touched it. The perfect murder. Again. I knocked on his door, just like I always did. Gerald opened it, the same disgusting grin plastered on his face. His eyes gleamed when he saw the lingerie, like he was holding my life in his hands. "Ah, another gift," he said, taking it from me. "You've been very obedient." I smiled, keeping the venom inside. "I do what I have to." His fingers brushed against the lace, and I watched, waiting. This time, I felt no guilt. This time, I was in control. As I turned to leave, he stopped me. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking. Maybe next week we could change the deal. I could..." He never finished the sentence. His face contorted, his words choked. He staggered back, his hands clutching his throat. I watched as his skin paled, the poison already working its way through his bloodstream. He gasped, his eyes wide with panic. But I didn't move. I stood there, watching, waiting, as the life drained from his eyes. And just like Zara, it was quick. I stepped over his body as it slumped to the floor, my pulse steady, There was no one to witness this time. No one to leave notes or make demands. I closed the door behind me and walked back to my apartment, feeling lighter than I had in months. No one would ever know. I killed to protect my fame, twice now. But this time, I felt no remorse. Fame has its price, and I was willing to pay it, even if it meant killing again.
My assistant Rhonda was a complete idiot. I tried to cut her some slack, but she kept forgetting to tell me about important meetings, and whenever I needed her for something, she was off for a smoke break. I wanted to fire her so badly, but she was my boss's niece. One day, she messed up yet again my lunch order, and I was furious. I think it was mostly the hunger talking, but I snapped at Rhonda for the first time. "I'm so sorry," she said, on the verge of tears. "I forgot you were allergic. There's a McDonald's down the street if you're really hungry." I quickly rushed out of the building before I said anything that I would regret. Rhonda was very close to her uncle, and I didn't want to tell him that she was a very difficult employee. I drove straight to McDonald's. Not my favorite, but it was fast. After I ordered, I noticed my coworker Nick was eating in the corner. He worked in accounting, and I had a little crush on him for a couple months now. He wasn't the hardest worker, from what I heard, but God was he handsome. I was surprised a guy with his physique would ever eat McDonald's. He waved over at me, and so I sat with him. I never talked to him outside of work before, but we started vibing right away. We ended up sitting together for an extra 30 minutes just because we were so lost in conversation. Then he looked down at his watch and said that he had to hurry back to work. I did too. We got in our separate cars and drove back to the office. I felt like I was on cloud 9 until I remembered that I was late. I didn't have any meetings yet, but I didn't trust Rhonda to handle things without me. I rushed back to my department, and Rhonda greeted me at her desk. To my surprise, I didn't miss anything. Nothing bad happened in my absence. I had taken some personal time to myself, and the world didn't collapse. Rhonda apparently was thinking the same thing because she said, "You always work through your lunches. You should go off-site more often. A lot of people do. That hot guy in accounting goes to McDonald's almost every day." That was a very persuasive argument. If I went to McDonald's, I'd get to see Nick again. I was too busy to go every day, but I could go once a week, Wednesdays. And every time I went, Nick was there. Sometimes he'd be there first, sometimes I would. We'd always order separately and then sit together. They weren't dates per se, even though I really liked him. And I think he liked me too. We had real connections, but I was too afraid to make the first move. Over the next few weeks, our Wednesday lunch dates got longer and longer. But whenever I went back to the office, Rhonda always had everything under control. Still, she made some mistakes, but she was getting better. I even decided to give her some responsibilities to see if she could handle it. Data entry mostly. When I was gone, she was in charge for filing separate spreadsheets on my computer. One morning, I saw Nick walking through the department. I actually hadn't seen him in the office since we started having our lunches together. He was always so busy. Right away, I knew that he was coming to see me. Our connection was too strong to be confined to a fast food restaurant. My heart raced. But then Nick approached Rhonda, and the two of them ducked quietly into a supply closet. He didn't even realize that I had seen him. Obviously, I pushed my ear against the door to hear what was going on. They were talking about me. I couldn't hear all the words, but I heard my name a couple of times, and the words 23,000. I looked around. The rest of the office was empty. Everyone was off at some meeting. I dragged a chair to the closet door and wedged against the handle, trapping them both inside. I didn't say anything. I kept listening, and slowly, I was able to figure out their plan. Rhonda and Nick were a couple. That was pretty clear. They were also working together to steal from me. Nick would keep me at McDonald's for as long as they needed, while Rhonda used my personal computer to rewire money from my bank accounts. She took small amounts each week, but over time, she managed to accumulate $23,000. Furious, I ran back to my desk and opened my bank account. Sure enough, money had been transferred into some foreign account. It happened like clockwork, every Wednesday at lunch. I felt like such a moron. I should have figured this out sooner, but I guess I was so distracted by Nick. He really fooled me. I called the police, and they charged back to the supply closet. Rhonda and Nick had already realized that they were trapped in the closet. They screamed and pounded on the door. "Who's in there?" I asked. They both went quiet. "You locked us in, huh?" Rhonda asked through the door. "Yep." "You know about the money?" Rhonda asked. "I know everything," I said. "Except the reason why. I won't let you out until you tell me." She didn't. That's probably the most frustrating part of this whole story. He had such a whiny voice when he apologized, and he tried to blame everything on Rhonda. Then Rhonda tried to shift the blame back to me. As they were explaining their many crimes, the police arrived. They stood with me and listened to the confessions on the other side of the door. Our boss, Rhonda's uncle, came with the police. He looked livid. He kicked the chair away, flung open the door, and let the cops take them both away. Since then, I got all my money back. I also got a promotion. I'm not sure what happened to Nick and Rhonda, but they don't work here anymore.